Hey y'all, it's Anna here in the Governor Dolph Briscoe Jr. Gallery, standing in front of our awesome Chuck Wagon here to read you a story. It's called Cowboys and Cowgirls Yippee-Yay by Gail Gibbons.
From the 1860s to the 1890s, the Old West was a rough and wild frontier. It was the era of the American cowboy. Not many women lived in the Old West, and there were only a few cowgirls. Besides, at that time, the work of a cowboy was considered too harsh for most women. Wealthy ranchers owned large tracts of land on which they grazed longhorn cattle. These ranchers hired cowboys, whose lives centered around tending the cattle, rounding them up, and moving them on long cattle drives for sale and profit. A cowboy's clothing was chosen for rough wear and tear. Many cowboys wore the same clothes for months at a time. Some even slept in them. Smelly and caked in dirt, these clothes were often burned after a long cattle drive. A cowboy's prized possession was his saddle. Without one, a cowboy couldn't work. The saddle had to be comfortable. Cowboys spent much of their time riding horses and ponies owned by the ranchers. Often the horse or pony became a cowboy's best partner. Roping was the most difficult skill for a cowboy to learn, and it was the most important. Cowboys carried ropes called lariats to lasso the cattle. It took many months of practice to learn how to spin the lariat and release it at just the right moment. Wild horses had to be captured and tamed before they could work among the cattle. A skilled cowboy called a bronco buster would mount and ride the wild horse until it would trot obediently around the corral. What a wild ride! Busting or breaking horses was a very dangerous job. Ranchers were unable to fence in the entire boundary of their many acres of land, so longhorns from different ranches would graze together freely. Once or twice a year, ranches held roundups. All the cattle and newborn calves would be rounded up or brought to one location. It was hard work to round up all those critters. Cattle are wild and fast. Any longhorn trying to get away would be lassoed and captured. The cowboy had a loop at the end of his lariat. When he twirled it and let it fly, the rope would snag the animal from afar. No cowboy wanted to get too close to an angry longhorn. When the cattle were finally rounded up, the trail boss from each camp would count his herd. He could tell which longhorns belonged to his ranch by a mark on his cattle called a brand. The calves didn't have brands. They were easily identified because they followed their mother. Next, the cowboys lassoed the calves. This was called chopping out. One by one, the calves were brought to a wood fire filled with heated branding irons. The cowboys took turns pressing a branding iron to each calf's hip, leaving a mark. Any stray steer within their own herd was lassoed, identified by its brand, and returned to the correct ranch. This was called cutting out. Cowboys who stole cattle from other ranches were called rustlers. These outlaws used a running iron to change the captured animals' brands to match their own. Pictures of rustlers' faces often appeared on wanted posters, and big rewards were promised for their arrest. After the roundup came the trail drive. The best and the biggest longhorns would be moved in one huge herd along a trail to the closest towns with a railroad station called a railhead. The cattle were then brought to market by train. Some trails were very long, nearly 1,000 miles. Cowboys could drive the herd for only about 10 to 15 miles a day. They didn't want to push the cattle too hard or they would lose weight, and they also took time to stop and let the animals graze along the way. Cattle drives could take many months. Only the toughest cowboys went on them. A herd of several thousand cattle might stretch a mile along the trail and be tended by as many as 15 cowboys. Each cowboy had his own task. The Chuck Wagon rolled along ahead of the herd, carrying food, cooking utensils, and bedding. Cowboys called food Chuck. The Chuck Wagon was driven by the cook, called Cookie. Next came the wrangler. He was in charge of the spare horses, often numbering as many as 100. This group of horses was called a remuda, a Spanish word. The trail cowboys would switch to fresh horses 3 or 4 times a day. The trail boss, also called the foreman, rode at the head of the herd. This cowboy had good knowledge of the trail, was able to communicate with the Native Americans they might encounter, and was an excellent tracker. As the cattle in the front of the herd began to move along, the other cattle followed. The front of the herd was called the point position. The most experienced cowboys rode as point riders. They guided the steer in an arrowhead shape, keeping the pace and moving them along in the right direction. Cowboys called swing riders moved the herd forward and made sure the cattle didn't spread out too far. The flank riders kept the cattle within the herd, preventing strays. The rear of the herd was called the drag position. The drag cowboys had the worst job of all. They rode through the thick clouds of dust, urging slow pokes along and keeping an eye out for rustlers. Some days the cowboys were in the saddle for 16 hours, a long, hard day. Because the Cookie traveled ahead with the Chuck Wagon, he was able to have food cooked and ready when the trail team arrived. A meal was usually pork and beans, sourdough bread, and coffee. "Come and get it," he would call. The cowboys often joked with the Cookie while they ate their meal. Many nights, cowboys would sit around the campfire telling stories and singing old cowboy songs. It was a time to relax and gaze up at the never-ending sky filled with twinkling stars. Some cowhands used their saddles as pillows when they settled down in their bedrolls to sleep. Day after day, the cattle moved along the dusty trail. What the cowboys feared most was a stampede. Cattle were easily spooked. Thunder and lightning or any strange noise could send the herd charging in a panic. It was the cowboys' job to get the herd back under control. Many cowboys were injured or killed carrying out this task. After a long, hard journey, the cowboys and cattle at last made their way into town. The cowboys moved the cattle into pens near the railroad tracks. From there, the cattle would travel by train 2 points east. The rancher was paid for the steer, and the cowboys were paid for their work. It was time to have fun. The first thing a cowboy wanted to do was soak in a hot tub. What a treat to get a haircut and a shave and to buy new clothes. The cowboys would then sing, dance, and have fun on the town. The sheriff always stayed nearby to make sure the law and order prevailed. Back then, cowboys and cowgirls showed off their skills at rodeos, and they still do today. The word rodeo comes from the Spanish word rodear, meaning to encircle or round up. People in the stands cheer as cowboys and cowgirls compete for prizes. Rodeos feature 5 main events: bronco riding, bull riding, bareback riding, steer wrestling, and calf roping. It's a colorful and rowdy scene. Today, cowboys and cowgirls still tend cattle and have roundups, but the days of the long cattle drives are over. Railroads can now be found near almost every cattle ranch. Many cowhands have college degrees in agriculture and livestock breeding. Cowhands drive pickup trucks and tractors and sometimes fly airplanes or helicopters to spot stray cattle. Cowboys and cowgirls today are still skilled in roping, branding, and riding horseback, just like the cowboys and cowgirls of the Old West. Famous cowboys and cowgirls. William F. Cody, also called Buffalo Bill, was a famous hunter, scout, and Wild West adventurer. He became known as Buffalo Bill when he formed Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Annie Oakley was a star of the Wild West show and could outshoot almost any cowboy in the West. Audiences applauded the skill and bravery of this hard-shooting, hard-riding woman. Wyatt Earp was a famous frontier lawman and gunfighter. He served as deputy sheriff and United States Marshal in several Kansas and Arizona cow towns. He is most famous for a gunfight at OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881. Bill Pickett was most famous for his riding, roping, and bronco busting skills. He became the first African American to be enshrined in the National Rodeo Hall of Fame. Calamity Jane was a famous cowgirl who claimed to have been an Army Scout and Pony Express rider. The Pony Express was a famous relay mail service that operated from early 1860 to late 1861. At one point, she rode alongside Wild Bill Hickok. She roamed the Wild West dressed as a man. Wild Bill Hickok was a scout and frontier law officer. He was famous for his marksmanship and bravery. From 1872 to 1873, he demonstrated his cowboy skills in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The best-known cowboy hat is the Stetson, called the John B. after its maker, John B. Stetson. The Texas Rangers were formed in 1835 to deal with outlaws, cattle rustlers, and conflicts with Native Americans. Between the 1860s and 1890s, there were about 40,000 working cowboys and cowgirls. Not all cowboys owned guns. Those who did use them mainly for protection against wild animals. Cowboys in South America are called gauchos. In Chile, they are called huasos, and in England, drovers. It's not true that cowboys and Indians always fought. Cowboys had more in common with most Native Americans than they did with city people. The trail boss sometimes paid a toll to Native Americans when crossing their land. They paid as much as 10 cents per steer or gave a few longhorns in trade. The Pony Express used cowboys to run mail between Missouri and California, over 2,000 miles of wild country. It ended after 18 months because of the invention of the telegraph. The American cowboy has always been a symbol of freedom and bravery.